G'day and welcome to the Genre Fiction Podcast. I'm Jack Roney,
And I'm Harry Colfer.
and we're going to try and continue. We've had a few false starts so far. We've had a couple of outtakes already. It's been a shocker. So, hey, welcome everyone to the latest episode of our humble little podcast. We have got Andy Edwards, who is a published author who publishes under AC Edwards. So, Andy is a former policeman, paratrooper, and special forces officer. He served in the Australian Army with operational deployments in Southeast Asia and retired at the rank of major. Andy has also worked as a security advisor across Southeast Asia, as a bodyguard, and as a security contractor in the Middle East and Afghanistan. He ended his career recently as the regional security director, Asia Pacific, for a multinational company and has now exchanged the corporate grind for full-time writing. Born in Singapore, Andy has lived and worked for much of his life across Asia Pacific. Today, he lives between Brisbane and Hong Kong, where his new thriller books, the Dragon series, are set. So, Andy, welcome. Thanks for joining Harry and I on our podcast. Great to have
Thanks,
you.
Jack. Thanks, Harry.
G'day.
We were having a good old yak before about your professional background, which we'll sort of touch on as we go. So we thought we'd better hit record because we're starting to get into some good stuff. So obviously you come from a real, can I say, a colourful background in terms of your professional career. We're really keen to sort of dive into how that has influenced your writing, particularly writing thriller, fast-paced, sort of page-turning thrillers. So I understand your series. It's the three books are Dragon's Back, Dragon's Claw, and Dragon's Eye. Are set within sort of the criminal underbelly of Hong Kong and other exotic locations. So can you tell us first of all a bit about your books and also your main character Galahad Jones, who I understand is a private investigator slash VIP protection specialist. Tell us about your character and your books.
Yeah, well, oh gosh, where do I start? Okay, so as you said, so this series, it's a trilogy. Technically speaking, I think you'd call it a connected series. So book 2 is a direct sequel of book 1, but book 3 is not a sequel of 2, but it refers and references back to 2 and 1. So connected series. Set in Hong Kong, but with little side trips out to the Philippines, and book 3 predominantly those set in Malaysia, with return to Hong Kong. So look, it all started one dark and rainy night, and we'll talk about weather and location probably. I think I'd had a couple of sherbets, and I was just sitting watching the trams move up and down Johnson Road in my neighborhood in Hong Kong. I used to live in a district called Wan Chai, and sitting there watching the trams and just watching life go by, and it just hit me that I'm going to write a book, which I have no idea where it came from. I hadn't been planning it. I hadn't been contemplating it. It literally just came like a bolt out of the blue. And then my mind, the way it works, I go straight from idea to execution, right? No planning, no second thought, right? What's this going to be about? Who is it? Where is it? And I just knew straight away that it had to be set in Hong Kong. It's a city that I know and have known for many, many years, that I love dearly, the city and its people. And I knew also that it offered up a very exotic, alluring location that not many people have seen or been to. Well, many have, but probably more haven't. And not many books that I've seen, fiction, thriller type books, have been set there. And that is books in English. So I really wanted to do it there. And the main character, and I guess we'll explore this a little bit if you want to, but first thing I should say is he's not me. Which, I think, Jack, you'd probably agree that Jared's not you in your fantastic series, but he sure as hell has a number of my characteristics, has a number of our experiences, if you follow what I'm saying,
Yeah, and I think I've had people say the same thing, and my character's me, but I guess a lot of it is he's probably who I would like to be, or he does and says things that I wish I could have done, and probably Harry's the same, and probably Harry.
Absolutely, yeah. My character, Jono, basically does and says all the things that I wish I could say in my day to day. But he gets away with a lot more than I could ever do, and it's a sort of like living vicariously through this character,
Yes.
But then again, some people do actually refer to me as Jono, so it's in my working life.
Well,
so I've probably done it a bit too close.
Yeah, and you mentioned living vicariously through your characters, and isn't that one of the great, maybe I'm sidetracking here, but isn't that just truly one of the great things about writing?
Oh,
Is
yes.
that for whatever reason, and we won't explore that, but for whatever reason, you can create and live in and control an entirely different universe.
Yeah.
You can shape it at your will, and the people in that universe you can shape at your will, largely speaking, although my characters do have a habit of running off track, which I'm more than happy with, but more on that later maybe. But, so Galahad Jones isn't me, but I sure would like to be him when I grow up. That's kind of, but one of the unfortunate things though, well, not unfortunate, but I chose to write the first two books in the first person. And that was a bit of a battle to decide how I was going to write that. And then it was even bigger a battle when I came to book 3, when I decided, against some advice, but I decided to switch into the omniscient third person narrator. And I guess we can talk about that if you like. But the problem with writing in the first person is everybody that knows me, that's read the books, they just say, I just hear your voice. But
it's very hard to conceal your voice, isn't it, when you're writing in first person, because you're divulging a lot of your own soul.
It is. But what's really interesting though, and I was very pleased about it, is that they all have said, because I was kind of disappointed that they heard my voice. They didn't hear Galahad's voice. But that changed. I'm very thankful, and maybe, I managed to do the job right, but the character's voice came through, and people have discussed with me how it wasn't me anymore that they were hearing. The guy had a totally different voice, particularly, of course, once they discovered his kind of blended ethnicity. So
tell us about that. So who is Galahad? What's his background? You talked about his mix of
all right, so Galahad, so he's middle-aged, and like so many people in the melting pot that is Hong Kong, he is of a mixed ethnicity or mixed race. His dad was born in Hong Kong during the war, of a UK Hong Kong expat family. Galahad's mum is herself a mixed race Hong Konger, about 50-50. So Galahad's kind of, by calculation, quarter Chinese, sort of 3/4 English, or European. So, and, he struggles with that, or has struggled with that a bit, because he kind of never really knew where he fit. And that was something I did want to explore, and I did want to sort of bring out in a character. And I wanted to make this not your average gumshoe character. And look, I confess to being inspired by your S.J. Paris's of this world, who, for example, have got gosh, and I've forgotten the other author. It's terrible of me, but we've got a hunchback lawyer, and we've got a cheeky defrocked priest, who are the heroes in their detective novels. And so Matthew Shardlake, the Shardlake novels, set in Tudor England, he's a hunchback and deformed, and so not that Galahad's race is a deformity, but I wanted to explore some unique aspects of him that would also help explain perhaps some of his less admirable personal qualities, because the guy has a very very wonky moral compass.
Okay.
So he's a very, very flawed human being. He drinks too much. He smokes too much. He's not averse to bending or outright breaking the law to achieve his aims, achieve his ends. And this is, again, something, that whole personal road to perdition kind of thing that he's always struggling with. But so that's kind of who he is. And he just invented himself, really did. The only thing I wanted was that I agonized over was his name. So and you guys have probably done exactly the same thing, and probably every author in the history of authoring has got that notebook out, and they've written all the surnames, all the first names, and they've tried to match them up, and they've spoken them aloud, and they've gone, well, that's rubbish, and
And how did you come up with Galahad?
Well, Jones actually was easy. His surname was very easy, but again, it struck me again, probably after another couple of wines one night, but it struck me that because the guy is so imperfect and so impure, that it was kind of ironic, or deliberately ironic, to name him after Arthur's purest of knights, the one knight who was so pure that he was the one willed by God to find the Grail. So that's a little bit of a conceit of mine that I threw in there. But interestingly, that ended up in some dialogue, I think, in book one, maybe even book two, where he's not blind to the ironies of who he is and what he is and his first name.
Are your books based in a time set? Because obviously things are changing in Hong Kong, and it would probably be more difficult to set stories in Hong Kong now.
Well, yeah, yes and no. So look, that's a very good point. I know exactly what you're talking about, and look, we can discuss that if you like. So, and this really is the subject of a very specific and podcast. We can discuss what's happening in Hong Kong, but since 2019 and what was brought on by the proposition of what was then called the extradition law, between Hong Kong and Taiwan, 2019 saw a terrible time for us in the city. A terrible time with very, very violent riots, a lot of people being killed, and the city being turned upside down. The city has recovered a great deal since then. And yes, there is no doubt that there are less freedoms in the city now than there used to be, only 5 years ago, and certainly than there used to be pre-handover. But let's also not forget, very, very quickly, without making this a lecture, there's never been democracy in Hong Kong, ever. There's just been different levels of benevolent despotism, and now you've got Beijing in charge. So look, it's a vexed question. But to get to your question, Harry, I don't set specific times. It's kind of you're kind of expected to know it's now-ish. Book one and book two, there's no real mention of time scale, and other than time passing in the narrative. But there's no mention of years and the like. And then book three, where we're bouncing between the UK and Russia and Malaysia and Beijing, it's all, although I do give years in the past, I'll say Kuala Lumpur 1956, but then it'll be Kuala Lumpur present day. So you can pick when you want it.
And it's obviously you're setting your story, and the setting of your story changes with time. Obviously, there has been changes. But for my writing, being because my main character is a paramedic, I have to be very careful of years, because they have different medical
different skill sets.
Absolutely. And so I have to actually say it's set in 2012, full stop, because otherwise I'd be incorrect by the medical interventions.
Yeah, I mean,
I was just wondering as to whether you've set it at a certain time so that it doesn't get involved in the politics.
Well, we'll park the politics for a moment. I'll bring that up in a moment. But I mean, a reader can guess pretty quickly that it's kind of the 2020s somewhere.
Okay.
And that's with particular reference to certain tech, I guess. And the occasional mention of a certain app, because when Galahad's trying to track down someone through open source intelligence, I'll use my experience in that and I'll describe how he's done it. And these are very recent, apps, brought to the public knowledge by an organisation you may have heard of called Bellingcat, and they run all sorts of trainings on OSINT, but that's another thing. Look, politics, I stay away from. Yeah. And I stay away from that for two primary reasons. The first one is my books aren't political. They're not meant to be political, although there is an awful lot of politics in them, so that there is official corruption at all sorts of levels. So I'm talking about the Hong Kong government, known as the LegCo or Legislative Council, and I'm creating fictitious characters of real roles, but I'm staying completely away from 2019 and forward. Other than every now and again, Galahad will make a little bit of a sly remark that will catch someone's ear. And, and they'll say something like, I didn't know you were political. Well, I'm not, let's move on. So I steer right away from it. And also, I don't want to lose my residency. I'd like to go back. Thanks very much. So, I've got friends and an apartment and everything. And, I don't want to be stopped at the border and asked to get back on the plane.
Yeah. I understand.
Can we jump back into your lead character? I know one of the things we're going to talk about later is some of the key elements to a good thriller, and one of those being your villain. One thing I wanted to segue into, and we've actually had another guest here on our podcast where we talked about anti-heroes, where you've got your traditional hero. And I'm just getting a sense that your main character is Galahad is more of an anti-hero. Like, for example, I recently, only a couple of nights ago, I watched Mad Max 2 again for the first time in years, and I'd forgotten how much typically Mad Max is an anti-hero, in that he's only out to do things for his own personal gain. He's not a typical traditional knight in shining armor hero, who's fighting for a just cause. In fact, these people needed his help, and he deserted them. And it was only until he was close to his deathbed and he had to sort of come crawling back to them that he said, okay, I'm now in, because he could see the benefits for himself. And, so oftentimes you can't help but love Mad Max for some of the things he does. And ultimately he still is very heroic, but, he's typically still out for himself. So how would you describe Galahad? Is he a mix of a hero and an anti-hero?
Look, I didn't set out deliberately to make him an anti-hero, although I didn't want to make him a slick, shiny character. Well, in fact, think back to those classic gumshoe detective noir novels of the 50s and 60s, right? Your Philip Marlowes and Sam Spades and those sorts of things. Now, those guys were pretty brutal, pretty conflicted men, and that's I deliberately wanted to pay homage to that. But Galahad, kind of his quirks and less than attractive character traits just kind of emerged. He ended up telling me that sort of stuff himself. I know that sounds really weird and corny, but he completely did. Look, there's a lot about him that's not nice to like. That's not likable. But he kind of always manages to, through a lot of wrestling with his own conscience, manages to at least bring himself back on some part of the straight and narrow to help others. But it may be the way he goes about it that's always questionable. And, I don't want to, no spoiler alerts here. He's certainly not above breaking the law to achieve his own ends. But then he's always conflicted about, well, what have I done? And so he's got just got this, sort of demon on his shoulder the entire time. That's probably got to do with his drinking as well.
Yeah, and we'll delve into that more as we start talking about, what makes a good villain, and how readers oftentimes can relate to a good villain.
Yeah.
And again, also a protagonist who is flawed, and they often talk about that's one of the key traits. Make sure that your characters are empathetic and believable, and your readers are going to really sort of relate to them because they're not perfect, because no one is perfect.
Exactly. We're all humans, and we are all, every single one of us, and we're all deeply flawed at some level.
Mm.
That's the human condition. So to try and create, or a world where these amazing, unimpeachable creatures walk through is to me, it's just a nonsense, and I think readers see straight through that.
Mm. Like your Jack Reachers. I mean, the Tom Cruise version of Jack Reachers, vastly different to the
new
novel
one.
version.
The new one's far closer to the actual
Yes, yes. He's this perfect human. He's buffed and big, and there's nothing he cannot do. So, Andy, what I wanted to sort of dive into is kind of that connection between your professional career, policing, military, international security, and everything else in between, and how you go from that to being a fiction writer. I guess there's two questions in terms of how much of that has influenced your writing, but secondly, you kind of talked about there was just a moment that you decided I've got ideas for a story, and you just started, and you executed your plan to start writing. Was there anything prior to that indicated that you had sort of the early signs of having an interest in creative writing?
Yeah. I'll take the last question first. I mean, I used to scribble in little lined exercise books as a kid, as a very young kid, and as a young teenager. For all I know, mum and dad have still got them in a box somewhere. So I always dabbled in the craft, in the art, and I've always thought that I've had a few good stories in me. I guess we all think that. I do have a bit of a natural talent for spinning a yarn. I'm a bit of a natural bullshitter, so that helps. It absolutely helps. So, I guess I've always dabbled in it, but it just wasn't a deliberate decision. It wasn't like, my corporate career is coming to an end. What am I going to do now? It just happened.
But did you find that it was cathartic in any way, that writing as this sort of detective in Hong Kong, you sort of were able to put a few of those demons in your past and slay those at all?
Harry, that is an excellent question, and it really does cut close. You're right. There are a number of things in all three books that touch on direct experiences that I've had that help me process those. In some cases, to bring them to a better conclusion than what was reality, both for me and for others.
Yeah.
And there is also no doubt that as I started to write, and it was true that I could see the writing on the wall for my corporate career as a very senior security professional in the region, that it eased that pain, because every time I sit down at the laptop, and in Galahad Jones's case, I'm running through one of his adventures, I'm back out in the field. I'm doing that surveillance. I'm back out, chasing the bad guy on the back of a motorbike. Look, there's no doubt that there's a lot of personal stuff in there. But I absolutely stress they're not autobiographical, that they're not intended to be. But I mean, it's the old write what you know about, trope, which I actually do think is true. I think it's a valid view. You write what you know about, and inevitably things are going to creep in there from your own experience. That's probably also why Galahad is the way he is, particularly physically and ethnically, because I really really wanted to make sure that I was ruling a line under him and me.
Yeah.
You know, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I'd like to do now is you've sort of given us a bit of a heads up of some things that you would like to share in terms of advice for writers. A number of people, a lot of people who listen to our podcast are usually emerging writers, and anything that we can kind of discuss and share about writing skills is really useful. So in your case, you know, given that you're writing effectively thrillers with sort of probably more complex political, criminal underworld kind of themes, it's a different genre again to your cozy mysteries or your regional Australian country town crime mysteries and the whole various subgenres of thrillers and crime. So there's a number of things I wanted to run through with you, and we
Sure.
sort of touched on it. One of the things you're going to discuss with us was how location plays a part, and you've already started to explain how the kind of the, if I can use the word, exotic. Probably for some people it is, you know, the idea of going anywhere in Asia is kind of, you know, fairly exotic, and how that plays into, you know, the importance of the location and how that plays into the story itself. So do you want to talk about that just very briefly, just, you know, generally about how the location plays into it?
Yeah, look, so from my perspective, I've always considered, and this is as a reader too, mind you, I've always loved to read books that take me there. And they can only take me there, I can only speak for myself, but they can only take me there if I'm seeing there in my mind's eye. And they can only do that if they are, you know, really accomplished at painting the location for me. So that was a very deliberate act on my part, and I'm really pleased that it seems to have come off. I mean, if my reviews are anything to be believed, that keeps coming up again and again and again, the location, and its description, the descriptive abilities or the description of Hong Kong, including with my Hong Kong friends and people who live in Hong Kong. So, you know, I just think it is absolutely vital. Although, you know, if you jump on, and I'm sure Harry and you, Jack, have probably been on, you know, well, they're not called chat rooms anymore, forums, writer forums, and inevitably this question comes up. And with location, I'll also wrap up weather. Inevitably the question comes up, well, do you or don't you? Do you do weather? And then it goes on to, you know, it was a dark and stormy night.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Nah.
Yeah, no, it was a dark and stormy night. But with completely shamelessly, the first couple of pages of my first book are set on a dark and stormy night. But I don't actually use those lines. But why did I do that? Because weather, again, is all part of location. Because I absolutely maintain that you should use location and weather when it adds value. I mean, otherwise, again, readers will see straight through it. If you're just padding, it's rubbish, and it's trite, and readers will mark you down for it.
And sometimes unnecessary prose can slow down the action as well. You know, I think the key is to try and drip feed those, you know, the essence of what's happening and the location, but in small amounts so that you can still keep the pace.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, what weather does and location, well, I'll just call it location, but let's take it as read that weather is part of that, because it is often part of the location. What that does is, you know, it sets tone, and it absolutely aids in building tension. It can mirror the character's mood. It can complement the action. So it's no secret that in Dragon's Back, the first book, the motif running right the way through the book was the presaging, the oncoming of a massive typhoon. So of course, in the final climactic scenes, the typhoon is hit. So nature is pummeling Hong Kong while this particular action is also happening in the midst of the storm. So, you know, it's a storm of action and a storm of nature. So I did that very deliberately. And it does appear again in book 2 when we're in Manila, doing some not very pleasant stuff, when Galahad is in Manila, chasing a triad killer. I'm okay to reveal that. It's important that people can see where he is and that they can ride along on the back of the motorcycle with him. Otherwise, it just, it could be anywhere, which absolutely takes away from the effect of the action that you're trying to portray.
If you're going to bring in a location, you've got to bring the weather with it, because Hong Kong people know it's going to be hot. But if your characters aren't sweating, or then or they're sort of dashing to get into aircon and stuff like that, that gives it more of a feeling of the location rather than freezing your butt off in Alaska. It's going to have connotations to how the story flows.
Yeah, so weather can make, because remember, you pick up any creative writing book or attend any course or whatever, go on any forum. One of the secrets is to make sure that your character's choices, because you're talking about character development, you develop the characters, but the character must develop along the way, for good or bad, really. So that character has to make choices, and those choices have got to be tough with a high risk of failure, generally, I would think. And what plays into that? Weather does. Absolutely does. So if there's a massive storm, or, if it's pitch black and he can't see his hand in front of his face because he doesn't have a torch, for example, time of day plays into it. So, it makes those characters' choices even tougher, or can do.
I had the privilege of meeting with Michael Connolly a week or so back.
Yeah.
He came to Brisbane for Brisbane Writers Festival, and I got to have a short chat with him. And I always I've used his books as guidance for the way I write, and he obviously uses LA as almost and he said it's a character within the book itself. So the actual location is a character. And I've tried to emulate that for Brisbane and my stories, and having Brisbane as a character. And it's an essential part of the story. It's not just this side tack on thing that just happens to be in Brisbane. You've got to have that sort of connection where your character is. And then, obviously for you, it's Hong Kong or Manila or the different places. I think that's incredibly important.
Oh, look, couldn't agree more. Location as character. So, I will spend, and I don't do it slavishly, and I don't do it predictably, but one of my human characters might not even be involved in this particular scene, but I will take the time just to describe the streetscape. What I'm seeing in my mind's eyes, to bring the reader into that. Then all of a sudden Galahad or his offsider Joey Lowe will appear, but they'll appear into the picture that has already been painted for the reader, and that's just about expressing the location.
Yeah
I love it.
And we've seen so many examples of it, whether you're talking about the Jane Harper books with The Dry and The Lost Man, and even the second book, Force of Nature, which is set in a rainforest. She captures that beautifully. I think that's why she was so successful.
The Dry was epic for that. Yeah,
it was interwoven with everything that occurred, and even the climax to the story was so connected to the drought and the fire, and it was built into the story. As you said, Harry, it's not just something, oh, by the way, it's happening to be raining. It's ingrained in the entire story. One that stands out to me is the movie Seven with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. And it's set in I can't remember, it's Chicago, one of those cities, and it is constantly raining and miserable. But it really adds to, like, every time they go into a crime scene where they find a new dead body, it's dark, and it's always raining, and it adds to the gloom of the story.
Yeah. Think back to Blade Runner, the original, right?
Yeah.
Always dark, always raining, and illuminated with neon. No surprises that what Blade Runner 2049, the sequel or the follow-up, was filmed in Hong Kong. So point proven. But it's an absolute, I think it's an absolute must. And it's funny how many writers tend to shy away from it. I'm not sure why. They just tend to, or they pay lip service to it, which is probably even worse.
I think, as we kind of alluded to, as a writer, it's hard to do well if you're doing it, if it's tokenistic, where you're seeming to try and describe the scene, but you kind of forget about it, and it's not interwoven into your story. I think you get caught out by the readers. I think it is a real skill to really cleverly, and it's a real craft to interweave the atmosphere, the weather, the location into your story.
Possibly it could be due to the fact that if you haven't lived there. So if you're writing a story in a location that you haven't lived there, then it will be difficult to get it right. And it was one of the, advice that I had to move my story out of Brisbane. And it's like, well, I can't describe Sydney streets. I can't describe what it's like, different aspects, different parks, wherever, wherever the scene's being set. Yeah, I could go and Google it and stuff like that, but I'm not going to get the same vibe. And I think that's where, if you're going to use a location, then it helps, dramatically helps that you've actually lived there and know what you're talking about.